Many of you will understand what I mean when I say that becoming a rights-respecting school is only a beginning. Leaders in gold schools frequently tell us that it was only when they'd achieved gold that they realised the richness and the depth that the convention opened them up to. And at that point, they began to really explore the challenges of what it really means to respect rights and to be rights respecting. Children and duty bearers coming over time to know and understand child rights begins a change process within a school community. School leaders and all duty bearers develop their awareness of the opportunities and the challenges that come with the increasing realization of a child rights approach. And it's one of these areas of challenge that we've chosen as the focus for our conference today. Every school lives with multiple pressures and tensions, but one of the most demanding surely must lie in the area of managing relationships, especially when rights come into conflict. The rights of an individual or small number on the one hand, apparently at odds with the rights of others, perhaps a larger group or even the majority. To open up this challenging area for us, we're really delighted this morning to welcome a long-standing friend of RRSA, Professor Laura Lundy. Laura is Professor Emerita of Children's Rights at Queen's University Belfast and Professor of Law at University College Cork. We probably all more readily associate Laura's work with her globally recognised work around meaningful participation of children and young people and the Lundy model. But in 2021, Laura collaborated with Professor Jenna Gillett-Swan to offer a rights-informed approach and model to consider responses to some of the tensions and conflicts that can arise between students and schools. As Laura speaks this morning, please post your observations and questions using the Q&A function, and my colleague Cathy Allen, one of the senior professional advisors in the Rights Respecting team, will collate the questions and then discuss some of those with Laura at the end of her talk. So Professor Laura Lundy, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us this morning. Thank you. You're still muted, Laura, sorry.
Did it again. Morning. Thank you, Martin. I was just saying I am really delighted to be invited to speak about this. I am, as you said, a long-standing supporter of UNICEF RRSA and any teachers and principals and other staff who are doing their best to apply children's rights-based approaches in school. So you've asked me to speak about this piece, and again, I was really delighted to do this instead of the Lundy model for a change. You know, it's something we have worked on for, as you said, for a few years back. This challenge is not just a challenge here in the UK or Ireland. It came actually from Australia to me to say I was speaking at an event that Jenna had asked me to speak at on inclusion, exactly the same topic as today, and I was asked to speak to the issue of whether the rights of, you know, the 29 outweigh the rights of the one. You know, you see that about in the media. And so I approached it, and Jenna and I then together collaborated with this article. And I'm going to take you through our where we stand on it as a way of encouraging conversation. Next slide, please. So who are we anyway? Well, you've given a little introduction to me. Thanks, Martin. You know, but what I am not, as you well know, is a teacher in a classroom at the minute handling these issues. You know, and so I come at this discussion and our conversation with humility and the hope to learn. And that really was the point of the piece. Jenna, on the other hand, has been obviously a practicing teacher and has faced these challenges in her own classrooms before she went into academia. But together we tried to come together to say, what do rights offer here? Next slide, please. Thorns, because this is a really thorny issue. You know it. School, it creates tension, it creates challenges where there are different approaches presented. And when we wrote the article, we were thinking, what about the other 29? That this thorny issue that schools are faced with very often, is that we wanted to, one of my favorite authors, not a child rights professor, so don't check that out. She's actually, I mean, if you know her work, she's a fictional author and one of my favorite. And it's this idea sometimes that you just have to take on and blurt bravely. And this paper and this model is offered in that spirit. Let's talk to lots of people, get a conversation going, and see where it takes us. Next slide, please. So in a sense, I have the Scottish, I know many of you are from Scotland, and RSA in Scotland is really phenomenal. Scotland, of course, is the only part of the UK at the minute to have fully incorporated the Convention on the Rights of the Child into domestic law, which means it is now an obligation, obviously, across the education sector. So we have to get on with it. But even if it's not Scotland, you know, the UK has ratified the convention, and you and us and others are all doing our best to ensure that it is implemented and feels real in children's lives. But what I want to say to you sometimes is that rights does not always provide the answer. As Jack Donnelly has said, rights are actually only put to use and important enough to really talk about when they're at issue, when they're questioned, threatened, denied. In some ways, and this might not seem real in some of your working lives, they come into their own when there is a conflict. They come into their own. That is the point where we have this arsenal of things, of principles to help us think through that's quite hard to say, think through the thorniest issue. And that is exactly what this model that we're going to suggest to you tries to do. Next slide, please. So this is it. And this is, today we're going to look at it in the context of challenging behaviour in classrooms. That's what we hear, or inclusion more broadly, as Carol will speak about later. But in many ways, whenever Jenna and I got together to talk about it, and we talk about it really very often because we see so much that comes up, it's not just for that. There can be other times when rights conflict in school that are nothing to do with this. And in some ways, the framework is a framework for all conflicting rights, and it's an attempt to take what is sometimes very obscure legal principles or sometimes things that are written very much from the point of like moral theory and put them into something pragmatic that helps those of you who are out there handling this, you know, in classrooms or wherever, sports fields, for example, given some people who are attending, it gives you a chance to think through how would we approach that. And we say that really the starting point is to classify, which is to identify the rights at stake, look where we can find compromise, where there appear to be conflicts. Sometimes you have to choose. Sometimes the rights of 29 will trump the rights of the one, or vice versa, and looking at what should be at play when we make those decisions. And then I'll talk about continue when we get to it. Next slide, please. So classifying in schools, it's the most complex. No one should ever suggest otherwise. It is the most complex child rights environment because, you know, in a normal human rights environment, you have the state and you have the rights holder, usually, you know, an adult or a child. But in the context of school, we have multiple rights holders. We have teachers and staff who have rights. We have one child, we have the 29 children, we have parents and carers. You know, so it's complex. No one can pretend that this is an easy thing to deal with, you know, especially in the context of schools. Next slide, please. What unfortunately is often presented then is, this is what Jenna, the entry point for us, is sometimes presented, it's the right to education of one child versus the right to education of the other children. And that is such a gross and misleading oversimplification of what is actually going on in these contexts. It's their education or his education versus their education. So that is, I say, so simplistic, so naive, and actually really problematic. Next slide, please. So Jen and I started to, you know, think and articulate, and this isn't even the full picture. It's what we presented in the article of whose rights. And we're looking in this case at the individual, the peers, the teacher. And look at that. And alone across the whole human rights framework, there are so many rights there for all of the children and also for staff. Next slide, please. So there's the Lundy model. One of the ones that cross-cuts, of course, is in all of it, no matter what. The individual child has a right to be heard, but so do all the other children. And that is something that is quite complex as well. I think we put into practice, which I'll come on to. Next slide, please. Parents' rights, often ignored in this. And you can't get away from the reality that within the Convention on the Rights of the Child, Michael Freeman, my academic mentor, has argued that there is a Convention on the Rights of Parents. Parents have a number of rights in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, including the right to provide guidance to the child in a manner consistent with evolving capacity. So you can't exclude parents in this either, their perspective. And then next slide, please. I'm sure this is what Carol will be speaking to. And it's not the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but it is the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is also ratified by the UK, and we are also bound to implement. So when we talk about the right to education, we are, of course, talking about a right to inclusive education. So the individual child whose behaviour may be presenting challenges still has a right not only to education, but to inclusive education. And in red there, I've highlighted some of the elements that are required by that, including, for example, Article 29, 1E. There are meant to be individualised support measures, providing environments that maximise academic social development with the goal of full inclusion. So the child doesn't just have a right to education, they have a right to inclusive education, and we have to factor that in. Next slide, please. So I suppose that's where it took us, that often when it's presented as the right to education of the one versus the right to education of the 29, we started thinking sometimes when actually everything is breaking down. It's usually not really the enjoyment of the child's right to education that's at stake. That in fact, often it's because we are not able to meet, we're not able to provide the child with the accommodations and the supports that they need. So in fact, what is presented as their right versus the other might in fact be an infringement of the right of that one child. If they are not receiving the support they need to stay and be included in the classroom, that is a breach in itself. So next slide, please. So basically, the first response, and I know this is what many of you, are striving to do, is to do what you can, do what is reasonable to address the violation, and that is to provide inclusive education. And I'm not going to say very much because I know this is actually the focus of Carol's work, but this is from general comment number 4 from the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's actually on inclusive education. Really tricky general comment, because even within that committee, there are a lot of very different perspectives about how we go about ensuring meaningful inclusion. But I highlighted a little bit for you to say that placing students with disabilities in mainstream classes without accompanying structural changes to, for example, organisation, curriculum, teaching and learning is not inclusion. And again, I know that you know that. Next slide, please. But if the issue continues, so say that the school is doing everything that they can, or the individual teacher or the support workers are doing everything they can to provide the individual child with what they need to be included in the classroom. So everything has been done to respect, protect, and fulfill the rights at stake. And I know that that's challenging in itself, and there's a lot of criticism there, which you'll maybe talk about. But next slide, please. We move to stage 2, and that is, instead of going straight to exclusion, we can't meet their needs, out they go. That is not a human rights-based approach. I'm talking to you about child rights, and that's the passion of all of us gathered in this room, I would say. But it is not, in the broader human rights approach, you don't move straight to denying a human right. You look for where compromise can be made. So, quoting again Michael Freeman, a better approach may be to respect all rights, but if sacrifice is unavoidable, let's distribute the sacrifice fairly. So let's look at where compromises can be made. Now, I'm not going to say a huge amount about this because I think this is very much within your own expertise. I just want you to think that many of the things that you're probably trying to do in your day-to-day work in schools sits here. You're trying to find ways to support the individual child. The compromise may be, and the most common version of that is the child does not get to stay in the classroom all the time. The child maybe does not come to school all the time for all the hours. There are all sorts of things that could happen there with that individual child, in ways to say they are not getting the full mainstream inclusive experience because it's not possible. We're compromising. So they're losing in some ways an element of the full enjoyment of their right to inclusive education. But I also want you to think on the other side of 29, where are the compromises that can legitimately be made there? I mean, to what extent do we have to insist on fully quiet and silent and calm classrooms? To what extent can other children cope with, tolerate, and enjoy, not enjoy, but even, I am going to say, benefit from a level of interruption or distraction because because the greater picture is that they are in an inclusive education environment, which is what we want. And I know that you're out there doing that. And we've been working with Education Scotland, and they have a pilot going on based on this structure and model from Jenna and I, which is gathering together across a number of case study schools how they handle it, because of course out in classroom, it's very different from me presenting this to you on a slide. Next slide, please. Third step is choose. So there is this reality that human rights sometimes are not compossible together. It's not possible to give this child the right to inclusive education and ensure that all these other children, and let's face it, it's never 1 versus 29. That's another distortion, but let's just use it because that's what the media throws out. So that all the other children also enjoy their right to benefit from their education. And it just may at times, and we know it, not be possible. And in that instance, the implementation of one human right, in this case, the right of the others to education and fully enjoy and profit from their education, may actually require the violation of another, that child will not currently be able to enjoy their right to inclusive education and stay within the mainstream classroom, for example. Now, I know, it's so different across the UK. We had a UK project, Excluded Lives, led by the University of Oxford, that looked at the very different approaches to school exclusion and sheer numbers of exclusion in the case of England that across the UK. So we have very different approaches to this. But in a sense, everyone is dealing with the same issues, and we need to be really clear that when we choose that we know what we're doing from a rights-based perspective. Next slide, please. So in human rights, it's essentially what we talk about is the proportionality test. Is it proportional? And Mahler talks about, balancing is about the sacrifice we can legitimately demand from one person, in this case, the excluded child, for the benefit of the other person or the public, in this case, the broader classroom or the teacher. Next slide, please. And it was tackled in an English case where regulations, which really struck the wrong balance, were shut down. I'm not going to go into the case for you now, but I will say that the judgment was interesting on this and did, really look at the fact that if you look at the quotation that I have there, the judge saying that we often don't really focus on the incredible and massive impact of taking a child out of school. As the judge said, excluding such children has a massive impact. The fact they'll struggle to get another placement, they'll be out of school for a long time. I don't know about this, but men, not the pupil referral unit with inappropriate peer groups and insignificant behaviour. That's not what all of the evidence, of course, whenever any of you've worked in alternative provision, that also there's all sorts of incredible positive work going on there. But at least it was trying to say, you do this to a child, it has a really significant impact. So your decision to exclude them must be proportionate. You must be prepared to live with that for this decision. Next slide, please. And then finally, I think this step is almost always ignored, and that is continue. And this is Jeremy Waldron, who's a human rights theorist, and I really love this quotation from him and for all of you, those of you working in this area. I think it's really a nice one to bear in mind for all of our human rights and child rights-based work. An individual right doesn't disappear from view once it's traded off against the rights of others. So the excluded child still has a right to inclusive education. That never changes. That it's always there. There has been this conflict, and is removed, but it should only ever be temporary. It remains in the picture, must be taken seriously. Rights don't generate a single duty. They got their one chance at exclusive education. They messed up and they've lost it. That's nonsense. Jeremy Waldron talks about successive waves of duty. So the trading off of one right against another, this child's right against the 29, is never the end of the story. And I think it then makes us think, what are we doing? How do we work? How do we constantly do better to get the child back into the school, back into the classroom? Next slide, please. So I've been really quick, so I can take lots of questions. That's quite good. I hope that's good. Although I'm nervous. So I suppose again back to the broader children human rights based approach. What I'm putting for you today is, you have all taken the time to look at this and find benefit in it. It rarely gives us clear-cut answers, but what it always does, it gives us a really principle, value, moral, legal-based way of thinking about these problems and working out what's at stake for everybody. And when we do that, I think we're going to go into the position of making better decisions. So it's a principle framework. And as Jenna and I said, we're not going to solve these issues for you. I wish, but at least it gives a transparent principled response to resolution. We also think that often from the work that we have and the research evidence out there, it's often the heart of human rights is transparency and accountability. That's what we're all about, ultimately. And there's a lack of transparency, in some ways a lack of accountability about what happens to children in these instances. So I suppose what we're suggesting to you this framework where rights appear to be intention and may not be intention, but if they are intention, it sounds like intention, but I mean intension, intention, that that there's a way to think about it and a way to handle it. And I don't think it's down to any individual school leader or teacher who is in this room or out in schools at the minute. And I suppose what we're trying to think is how can we work with providers like Education Scotland and others to provide a framework that allows a pragmatic, because you're also busy and you're dealing with these issues, and there has to be a pragmatic way in which we can go about it with guidance that comes from you, from the field, about what works, where can the compromises be made, where are they effective, what's the evidence for that. And then finally, just rights generally. This is back to Jack Donnelly. I mean, adults and children with disabilities had to wait a long time to get their rights acknowledged, and this right to inclusive education, it was really hard one, really hard one, and it continues to be a struggle to enjoy it. And so I suppose what it does, this language takes us away from really oversimplified, unhelpful, problematic debates like presenting things like the rights of one and the rights of 29, or the rights of the many and the rights of the few. It's the rights of all. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm really happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was so interesting. And it was lovely to hear the paper brought to life. I think it was really interesting to hear how it works in practice. And I think it was definitely really resonating with me going into rights respecting schools. We see schools on a daily basis meeting these challenges, using rights to negotiate these situations and thinking about rights and putting them at the centre. So it's brilliant to have this classify, compromise, choose, continue framework that can help us develop that thinking as well, which is lovely. We've got lots of questions.
Okay.
Some that may be kind of challenging to answer. I think there's lots of support and advice that's kind of being asked for. But let me just pull together some of the thoughts that people have. So with some people are thinking about how schools can really uphold children's right to that inclusive education when the current challenge with resources and specialist support and access, and I know you won't have an answer to this, but it links in with something that Idanella was asking as well about really putting children at the centre and thinking about how we can really make those decisions effectively when we might be facing those issues around safety and thinking about in the moment when we're thinking really quickly in school. So any advice for schools on that kind of classify area?
I expect both of those, and I agree completely with where they're coming from. I mean, the first one in the actual paper, I didn't go into it, but the quotation at the end with Jack Donnelly, that point about advocacy, we know that schools are dealing with the fallout, from not just resources in schools, but resources in society, and family and child poverty, and there, so we totally understand that. And I think, so the point about advocacy at the end and where we would conclude the paper is essentially, we need to do better to understand what's actually needed, for schools to be able to deliver fully inclusive, I'm sure Carol will talk about this, fully inclusive education. And I don't want to do the whole classic thing that people do, blaming schools and teachers or throwing it all to teacher training, because of course that's not the only answer. It's much more complex and nuanced than that. But at least I suppose in a way, when we look at this again from a child rights perspective, we have the language for advocacy to call the problem, not just the immediate problem in the school and the numbers of exclusion, but the problem that schools are now facing a lot of issues that are outside their control. So I think I totally agree. Schools obviously we need teacher training and better resources, and we need ways of helping schools, which is where we're at, because schools are handling, there are schools that are, who are deeply under-resourced, who are handling things really well in spite of that, but they shouldn't have to, So I completely agree with that. And then I think the safety and the physical safety of staff and students is a live issue. And then when we go back to the rights, the right to be protected from harm, Article 19 of the Convention for Children, but teachers also have a right to be protected from physical harm. And there's no question that whenever a child is violent, of course, when you're looking at the proportionality, that does tip that test, where it can be proportionate whenever there is actual danger presented to children and adults alike by a child's behaviour. So I think it's absolutely a factor that should be considered, no question. Yeah.
And I think you touched on this when you were talking, actually, but there's a question about when a child's behaviour repeatedly disrupts or harms the education of others, would exclusion ever be that rights-based decision rather than a rights violation? I know it's a kind of really tricky situation, isn't it?
There's no one answer to this. I'm not going to give you a definite answer, because that's not, it would be silly of me to do that, given everything I've said. But I think, again, you're right. It's that, the persistent small disruptions, I think, in some ways, is that what you're talking about, Kathy?
Yeah, in a way, that's possible what the question's alluding to,
Okay, I totally understand how that can be that. And I suppose that's what I was asking in terms of the compromise, how much of that can be tolerated when it's not fully disruptive. And I don't get me wrong. I've worked with teachers for the last 25 years, and, they talk to me about the constant tapping of the pencil, all of the little tiny things that are not big, but can be so distracting and disruptive for the teacher concentration. I understand that. But you phrased it in a different way. You were sort of saying, is it a rights respecting answer instead of a breach? Yeah.
And I suppose you could think about that in that if exclusion leads to the correct education for a child, it's not, then is that, and I'm not advocating for this, because you could avoid exclusion completely by putting a child into another provision or supporting them to access the correct provision.
I think it's the way with the questioner you phrased it was interesting, though, and I suppose if I haven't thought of it that way before, so I'm speaking on the hoof, but I would suggest that those two things can sit together. You can have, in a sense, a denial of the child's right to inclusive education defined by education in mainstream school, and it can still be a rights-respecting response. And I suppose this is what I'm trying to get across to you today, that it is a frame. Not all rights can coexist together all the time, not just in school, not just in this instance. It's just a reality. We have conflicts of rights in relation to sometimes freedom of expression and people's right to safety. It happens in other environments. So you can have the denial, and it can still be a rights respecting response. What we are suggesting is a rights respecting process for handling it. That's perfectly okay everywhere. What we're worried about, and then I know I'm talking to UNICEF, RRSA, but the reality is in many schools who don't come at this from a rights respecting process, there are pressure from parents of the 29. There's, under-resourced, demoralized teachers, lack of resource. The easy solution often is just to expel the child quickly, get them out, and that is not a rights respecting approach. And what we're presenting is a way of thinking through that. And hopefully, and this is somewhere where, I'd love to work with you, UNICEF or RRSA, is to gather the examples of these compromises. What does it look like? What can we do? What's working for you? What's not? And what do we feel is legitimate, or what is disproportionate? And I think sometimes we go in with the sledgehammer, because, and I think At no point I want to blame a teacher who has been threatened and immediately wants the child out of a classroom. Of course, it's a normal instinctive response, but we as schools and as education systems, and also, I mean, you as a community, back to my very last slide, are an incredible potential with UNICEF itself, which of course at root is about child rights advocacy, is to highlight what's happening and the inability to deliver the inclusive education and the ways and also the evidence for what work and what should be supported. So that's very long and very preachy. I'm very sorry.
No, no. And I think we'd love to work with you as well, and hopefully through the rest of this morning and with the panel, you'll see some examples of how schools are managing this, and really putting kind of this inclusive practice and putting using that rights framework to explore that and using your model, hopefully in action, and without knowing it, maybe thinking about that. We've got some other questions coming through with regards to that increase that we're seeing in England, particularly with children with special needs in mainstream schools and the behavioural challenges, but then also sitting alongside that, that actually the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities advocates for inclusive education being fully integrated. But what in England, what we're seeing is a rise in some alternative provision and parents wanting children to sometimes be an alternative provision. And what are your thoughts on how do we resource this, and where should we sit? Do you think?
I mean, this is really, really tricky. And I mean, I know as a fact that when General Comment number 4 on inclusive education was written, even the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities took different positions on this, okay? But the General Comment itself does not in the end. I mean, the human rights provision is that children should be educated in inclusive environments, so together. And that's what we should always be striving. There's just no question of that. But what I'm not going to do is, look at the reality of when you have a context where school is not working out for many children. And I'm not talking about the disrupted children, but we know we have this crisis of social anxiety in school, refusal, and many children legitimately are not comfortable in their school environments and then thrive outside. So I'm not going to in any way try to undermine or criticize the incredible work that goes on in alternative provision. Because we know, I mean, we've been there myself, it's incredible. And it often provides an environment that is exactly what a child needs, which is why I was kind of criticizing the judge, exactly what a child needs, and very difficult to deliver in a mainstream school through sheer numbers, resource and pressure. So it's just a fact. I don't have an answer to it, except that we know the answer is not within schools themselves. It's in that bigger picture that the first question was about how we are able to deliver fully inclusive environments within the context of mainstream schools, and that needs to be fully resourced. We need, better staff-student ratios. We need teaching, we need resources, we need to look at our curriculum, we need to look at our broader education approach and goals, because there are other countries who are getting this right. It's a problem in Australia, it's a problem in New Zealand. I've been in lots of countries where I've talked about this, but there are countries that are like Portugal who are doing a much better job than us with very limited resource,
Okay. Is there anything that jumps out that they're doing that
I don't know, because I don't know enough. It'd be worth talking to the Portuguese educators, but the example that's often given is that they have so few, alternative provisions. They have a really big emphasis on inclusive education, and they see, I'm sure it is deeply imperfect. And if you were talking to Portuguese teachers, they would raise lots of issues that are being raised today. I haven't done it, so I'm outside my comfort zone now. But I think there are others, and I know for a fact, because of the research we did with Excluded Lives across the UK, there are incredible work going on in some schools to provide, fully inclusive environments, to say that no child gets excluded, and this is the way we work at that, so it's possible.
It is, and as I say, we definitely see that practice, and I've seen some lovely examples in our schools, which is fantastic, and as you say, working with those limited resources and within the capabilities of the settings. We've got another kind of strand of questions coming through, which jumps back to thinking about the child at the centre of this, and thinking about kind of the children involved that we're talking about. How can we really meaningfully include the voice of the child who is displaying that challenging behaviour in those decisions about their support and inclusion. And kind of, I suppose this goes back to the Lundy model. And do you want to share with us a little bit about kind of the best practice around doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to give the Lundy model lecture. You can get it on YouTube, you know, any amount of time. What we didn't overemphasize it in the paper, even that's probably where Jenna and I both come from and where we got together, I suppose, in our work and collaborated, is, I mean, I hope I'm not overstating this, so argue back, but it just strikes me, you know, you all know that children have a right to have their views sequestered freeze really and have them given due weight, Article 12. And we also know that the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities says that children with disabilities should enjoy this on an equal basis with other children, but they don't. They don't, okay. So put that to the side. You know, if you were creating safe, inclusive, meaningful opportunities for the individual child, we would be in a much better place to understand what was going on, to address what's going on that's manifesting itself this way in the class. I'm not saying it'll solve it. Talk to the child, find out. So it won't solve it, but you definitely won't solve it without finding out. It's impossible to solve without talking to them. Yeah. You know, it might not, talking to them might not solve it, but it definitely will never be solved without talking to them. Absolutely. Yeah. And if you want to think about that because of the community that we are this morning from a rights perspective, you know, if you've ever have heard me talk or read my writing, the right to be heard is a right in itself, but we know it's a means of realizing all other human rights for children. Mm-hmm. It's a right, and that's a means of realizing the right to education. It's also a means for realizing their right to inclusive education. Now, I'm going to throw a spanner in here, a curveball, and I will wait for the resistance. What Jenna and I started to talk about. We talk a lot. You know, we still talk a lot about this paper every now and again. We're on WhatsApp and at unholy hours for both of us because she's in Australia. And what we feel there's not been a lot done with the other 29. Mm-hmm. We don't have a lot of evidence about the extent to which the other 29 witness and perceive it in the same way as sometimes staff do. We don't know. There hasn't been the data as far as I know, you know, and we're wondering, and, you know, just from anecdotal pieces, you know, and again, you know, you hear bits and pieces where other children feel that things have just got really tough and tedious, and that's when this child kicks off, and then they're all delighted because they get a break and a distraction. You know, it's not that they feel their education's destroyed, you know, and that's anecdote. Yeah. But we just don't know. And I suppose it'd be interesting to, you know, have work, you know, and again, there's no better place, I think, to really carry out that work than UNICEF RRSA community, is what within a whole school community approach would these compromises look like? You know, in ways that, you know, are non-stigmatizing to children, keep children in. Because, I mean, one of my very first pieces that I wrote on the right to education long before the Lundy model stuff was really, you know, one of your obligations that you've all committed to in Article 29 of the Convention, you know, is to provide, you know, is to promote tolerance, you know, and respect for difference. You know, that's what we're all, you know, it's in your vision statements probably of every single school here, and rightly so. And what I wrote then, and it actually was pretty sensible given I knew a lot less than I know now, is that you can't promote respect and tolerance for difference if you've nothing different in your community to tolerate, you know. So if you take it all out, you know, and the reality is we're going to go out and live in societies, and we want not just our schools and our homes and our communities, you know, we need it. And gosh, do we ever need it more than we need it now, you know? Yeah.
No, I think it's really interesting in thinking about kind of our practice in schools, and when we visit our gold schools and we talk to children about that equity in school and what that looks like, and that kind of acceptance, that tolerance of the differences within the classroom, and as you say, thinking about how do those 29 children potentially feel in relation to that. And we've got questions in the chat that we'll come back to if we can, around kind of the othering of those 29, and I suppose that links with what you're saying, that do we know what they think? Have we included their voices in the
pulls out
definitely.
any teacher in your group or any principal. There's not another 29. Like
Yeah,
one
no,
child,
there's
there's
not,
not
yeah.
another 29.
Definitely.
You know, there are
Yeah,
29
it's a
dealing
mix of
in some schools. I think
yeah.
it was interesting. I did speak to a friend of mine. I worked with her when I was a teenager in Primark, or Primark as you call it in England. We call it Primark here.
Yeah.
And she's now principal of, I think, the most disadvantaged school here in Belfast, I would say. You know, I think it's an RRSA school too. And
Okay.
you know, I've had this conversation with her, and she goes, "The
Yeah.
nonsense." She said, "It's the whole 30 in my class. It's the whole 30."
Yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
if we got rid of all of them, we'd no jobs. You know? So it's like,
Yeah.
you know, so you know, you've got to think, you know,
So it is. It's
yeah,
yeah.
it's not, it's so simplistic, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know?
It is
And
definitely.
it's not always behavioral issues, it's
No,
poverty, it's mental health issues, it's gone
there are
home,
so many
families that are
things.
falling apart. You know, it's all of
Yeah.
those things, yeah?
Yeah, I think a really interesting comment that's come through in the Q&A as well is that some feedback about the Portugal model. So it's saying that the key difference in Portugal is the provision is
Oh,
planned around
interesting.
the need of the children
Oh,
rather than
good.
diagnosis, and thinking that
Ah,
actually putting the child at the centre and the need of that child, which many of
interesting.
our schools do really well, but maybe through policy isn't
Yes, it's the
the
national approach.
focus
No, thank
is.
you for that,
Yeah,
David. Yeah,
so
thank
I
you.
think
Yeah.
that's really interesting to think, given what you've just said as well about thinking about all the children in that class and that setting as well. So yeah, fantastic. Let me just have a quickly check in the chat. We've got lots and lots of questions coming through. Probably take a couple more and then we might break a little bit early for the break, if that's all right,
I'm
Laura.
sorry I spoke so quickly. I was thinking it would take me
It's all
forever,
right.
and then I rushed.
No, well, we've got so
Jenna will
many,
be
we've got
cross at
so
me.
many questions that don't worry at all. Let me just see what it's not. So it's not a question, but someone's just kind of putting into the Q&A that a rights respecting approach must underpin most of what you do as a school and set the culture to be alive, is what they're saying. And that must talk to the policy ethos and restorative behaviour management processes, which is what you've been talking about, that engagement of every party and those relationships.
Yeah,
So really kind of just reiterating what you're saying, that all relationships should be modelled by stakeholders, by those duty bearers and those rights holders within a setting, and driven by leaders. So kind of really thinking about that sense of belonging and how that voice is at the centre of that inclusive.
Absolutely, belonging is the word, isn't it? If they feel they belong, you know, it's often, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And there's some observations around kind of thinking about parents, as you've talked about in there as well, and bringing in that dynamic and really working with parents about that rights respecting approach as well. And if we're bringing them on that journey with us and supporting them to engage in rights, that can really help those conversations. And as you say, that classifying of the rights of everyone involved.
But the parents thing I didn't say a lot on, so I'll say something else. I mean, I don't know the way that you frame them, but what I was putting to you this morning is see them as rights holders too. They're rights holders in their own right, you know, because this right to provide guidance. But it's really, I haven't written enough about this, but that you cannot deliver children's rights without, you know, involving their parents and carers as well, you know, in school or anywhere else. So the ways in which we engage with parents to try to, and I know that can be difficult because they can be very upset and very angry about things that are happening with their child and very frustrated what's not happening with their child outside school.
Yeah.
But at least to understand what they think are the solutions, you know, to this, you know, would be really, it's just an obvious thing, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think they're such an important part, aren't they, in thinking about that. So yeah, so we've got some other, we have hundreds of questions in the chat that you maybe need to have a look at afterwards. But think
I'd
about
love to see, Jenna will love to see them. I mean,
there's so many coming through. I'm just trying to pull some of the themes together and thinking about, actually this one's really interesting, that thinking about how can we effectively educate children on what conflicting rights mean and how to deal with that, because I think that's something that's really important, isn't it, to that conversation that we're talking about as adults, understanding this process. But how do we support children to deal with conflicting rights in practical terms?
Yeah, so that is really interesting. I'd like to think more about that and hear your own ideas on that. But I know that obviously a crucial element of what you do, as well as model rights respecting practice in your school environments, is that you are child rights educators. You know that you're teaching children how to respect child rights. I don't know other rights. Not sorry,
No,
you're not.
yeah.
So that's completely wrong. The last sentence. You're not teaching children.
Know
You're
them, yeah.
teaching your children to know, to claim their rights.
Yeah.
So I think that is really interesting itself. And I imagine, Jenna and I, when we first got together, she came over here to Belfast and we sat with it. We knew this was the main scenario, but we sat with lots of different scenarios where children, the rights of one child might seem to click. I mean, it could be like things like, school vaccinations. I know it's not the law here, but in other parts of the world, you have this children get vaccinated, they can't go to school. There are lots of potential tensions, and it would be really interesting to develop some case studies to actually talk to children through. So we explain how rights work and we explain, that there is no one right answer, but it, helping us articulate what's here. And for me, what I would find fascinating is that to see this is almost the point, the missing evidence that I'm talking about, what most children think about this and what's right and what's wrong in terms of that. It would be interesting to just, create some kind of resource that looks at this.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's something. It's the next step, isn't it? We can take that away from this morning, but definitely, yeah. And I think it's something that we can look at with our gold schools and kind of talk to children about. And I think it definitely comes through that sense of when you're claiming rights and but knowing that rights are universal and unconditional. Kind of how that's kind of how it frames these relationships in school. But
then that's
when there are those discussions around clashes and when things intersect and how we managing that and how us teachers in school managing that, because they're on the face of it doing that work, aren't they, and working with the children. So yeah, really interesting.
Human rights are universal and they're inalienable, but they're not necessarily unconditional because they have conditions within them and then they have to be balanced against each other. So I think our paper in some ways, I don't want it to be used just an excuse to go, okay, that's good, you can't exclude them. Of course you can exclude them, but that's not what it's about. How do we do this in ways that still attempts to be as rights respecting as possible, I think is really what we're trying to say.
Yeah, definitely, and keeping those rights at the heart of it, isn't it? And I really like that kind of in the kind of sense of that compromising and choosing, but then continuing that we're. I know our schools are always thinking about how can we improve this practice? How can we really be fully inclusive? How can we move forward? That if we've had to remove a child from a class for a particular reason, how are we going to change that next time? What's going to change? How can we bring this back? So I think it's really kind of interesting to see what comes out of the work that's going on in Scotland as well around this framework and thinking about putting it into practice.
Just going back to the parents, it just it's an anecdote, but I think it probably was quite a significant moment for me. Whenever one of my children was in primary school, there was a boy who was presenting with very challenging behaviours, and I think some of the other parents found out that I knew something about education law, and they came as a kind of posse to me. To get me to go and speak to the teacher to get the child removed. Well, gosh, did they go to the wrong person? It's like, and I was thinking, I was so shocked, and then and the child was removed in the end, and he was incredibly talented, and he was in a little club and an acting club. He's incredibly talented in other ways, but that my wee acting thing that my daughter was no good at, but was in. But in a way, that attitude, and I think this media stuff fills in that it was legitimate for them to come to use me as a lawyer. And I response, of course, was this child is entitled to be in this classroom, and it's the school's obligation to try to find resource. And if that's not possible, then down the line. But so that, we need to work with our parents so that they understand why you're doing things the way you're doing,
definitely. And keep them informed of why that decision making, isn't it? And I think we get really good at doing that in rights respecting schools. We see that practice around engaging children in that decision making and that's and bringing parents in as well and really making them an active part of the community and engaging
and understanding
them in that.
why it is you do what you do the way that you do it. And it's not just for it benefits all the community and their children too, you know. I mean,
Definitely.
The point put to me was that Northern Ireland still keeps the 11 plus test in P7. I think they're P6. This is going to fail their 11. They're all going to fail their 11 plus. You know?
Oh, because
it's
like, one child, yeah.
Because you all have them privately coached anyway. So
yeah. So, you know.
So, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really interesting to think about kind of how we're empowering children through understanding the decisions that are made in school and how we can bring that out with parents as well and then engage them. And schools are, we've got some great examples again of schools that are doing this, but pulling that together and using that to support and advocate for that greater resources and that focus on inclusive education would be fantastic. Amazing. Thank you so much. You'll have plenty of time to have a look at the Q&A as well. And I think people have been making lots of comments, which has been fantastic. So I think everyone's found the Q&A, which is great. It is on the taskbar at the top. You can comment on other people's questions as well for everyone who's watching. So please do get involved. And Laura, that's been so informative and just really, it's great to deepen our understanding and our awareness of how we can implement the CRC and what it means for us in practice in our schools. So thank you so much for giving us your time and your support, and we look forward to taking this further after today and seeing where we can go to working together next. That would be absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, and thank you. I just want to say I've learned a lot. I mean, I'm always a little bit nervous coming with this one, you know. So
I've learned, a challenge, yes.
Yeah, but I'm happy. The point is to have the conversation. So thank you for everyone who's engaged with it. Thank you. Yeah.
No, thank you. And I think that is the point, isn't it? It's to be open to ask those questions and we haven't got the answers, but we'll keep working on it, keep talking about it. So thank you, everybody. That's been absolutely fantastic. We're now going to take a little bit of a break. So you get a chance to stretch your legs.